Welcome to Sundays with Stories. This is a weekly podcast brought to you by the Life Process Program, or LPP, our online addiction coaching program. I'm Zach Rhoads. I'm here with Dr. Stanton Peele, the creator of the Life Process Program. In most episodes, we highlight and react to the past week's addiction-related news, giving you a realistic, psychologically and culturally relevant take on the news. Today, we're going to take questions for Dr. Peele that we've pulled from Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and our mailing list, and from participants in the program. We do think it's important to interact with listeners and viewers and to the participants in our online coaching program. So we promise to do more of these in the future and keep the questions coming. If you want to learn more about the Life Process Program, visit lifeprocessprogram.com. And of course, subscribe to this YouTube channel or check out the LPP podcast on your preferred podcast app. Lastly, to submit questions for future Q&A episodes, you can send them to zach@lifeprocessprogram.com or visit any of the social media links, which you can get from our show notes. So Stanton, let's jump in with questions. And
I just wanted to mention that the questions are great. A lot of them are they're personal and practical. And I mentioned to you, we might break it down where I provide a more theoretical response and you more of a clinical one. That's an oversimplification because we both combine those elements. But we'll, I think, both be throwing in some answers. So, but you go ahead and start off with the questions.
And before I do, I'll say some of the, people have typed them out on social media. Who knows if they were in their cars or on their way to an appointment or something. So I might try to for some of them, I might try to do my best to reflect what the question's asking rather than reading it verbatim. Question one says, in rehab, I've been told to avoid circles of friends who I once used with. Avoid them at all costs, but I've been in situations that call for me to connect with old friends. One of them is now paralyzed and reached out to me, and I never know which day may be his last. What do you think about the idea of avoiding friends or friend groups to eliminate old patterns? To what extent should someone follow that rule? And what could be some signs for myself that it's okay to communicate with the person or not?
Well, I do want to get your inputs on this, Zach. You made some, so your life has changed a lot socially in between your being addicted and not. I was I had a residential treatment program, and people would come from their homes and come to a place and go through 3 months of rehab. And then they went home. And so I developed, and that's not unusual. I mean, if you want to quit smoking, you don't want to get divorced. And if that extends to just a lot of other things, you're not going to do away with seeing your children or your parents. And so my partners were a little hardline on that issue initially. And what I instead developed was a family part of the rehab plan, because especially since the Life Process Program was different from everything people knew about, we had to sort of tell them what we were doing and prepare them to be responsive to the client when he or she got home, and also to be able to duplicate their learning, to learn that addiction wasn't a disease. And one of the things another question is going to bring this up is mutual responsibilities when they got home. So I imagine when you answer that question, I imagine the questioner, when they ask that question, is part of a social group, and it was, maybe they're younger, and it was a largely drug or alcohol using group, and they just feel, well, this isn't a good group for me. And you could see in a situation like that, well, I want to participate with people who are just more positively oriented. Another question that we're going to get to is what my favorite drug is. And so I've had a chance to evaluate who I hang out with, mainly around alcohol. And then the answer to that question becomes, well, some people drink alcohol in a productive and stimulating way, and those are people I enjoy being with, and others don't. So you should pick your group. On the other hand, the specific example you give of being, not deserting an ill friend, I mean, you don't stop being a human being. In fact, you want to encourage you to be more of a human being, more of a, again, to use a technical clinical term, more of a mensch as a result of going through the life process program or overcoming an addiction. So your normal, I mean, if a friend asks for help, I mean, for example, what if you stop doing something or some activity or some way of doing drugs, and somebody in your former group said, gosh, I'd like to try and make that kind of a movement myself, then you would just be normally helpful. On the other hand, an important part of mindfulness is being aware of destructive relationships and, being willing to terminate relationships that aren't productive or positive for you. So there's no simple answer. You have to use the basic criteria of your humanness. You're being helpful to other human beings. You're being a part of an ongoing family social group, which you're not going to just desert. And you're being able, as we're going to discuss in a further question, how to change that group, if it's a family, for example, in a more productive direction. Zach, did you make a total exit from your heroin group when that stopped being your axe?
For the most part, but you bring up some key points. So I did a full exit, but part of my just building myself up as a person involved getting a better handle on who I was and why I spent time with people. If I'm going to spend time with a person, what's in it for me? What's in it for them? What's the purpose of this? Am I helpful in this relationship? Are they helpful in mine? Is anything destructive about it? And so that's sort of that's a base
evaluating who you're going to go forward with.
Right. So the context and the situation really keeps the score. I mean, if you feel obligated in some way to be around some person, and you wonder, well, should I really involve myself with this person? I mean, after all, I associate them with some of the worst times in my life or something like that. You can ask things change and circumstances change, and you can ask yourself, what is my reason for being involved in this? And is it constructive or is it destructive? So at this point, I have rekindled with some people who I know who are in bad places, as I was when we were using drugs. And it wasn't just that we weren't just reliant on a drug, we were sort of reliant on each other, but not for any constructive purpose. It was for, procuring drugs, doing drugs, and then that was it. We'll do any stupid thing. And it wasn't a friendship per se, it was just we were associates in this weird lifestyle that we were living. But people change, and I've met people who are down on their luck, who have asked things of me. For example, there was one person who had a kid, and I would suspect that his behavior hadn't changed all that much. But he was wondering about how to work through involvement with the Department of Children and Families, which is another cue that usually the Department of Children and Families don't enter someone's life unless something bad's going on.
Trouble to know about.
But I thought, well, he's asking for my input as a professional who's worked with those kinds of systems before. He's not asking me to do a drug. So I took a phone call with him, and we went through it. I asked him how he was doing, and he said, I'm trying to take care of myself and take care of my kid. This is important to me. And, this is sort of a wake-up call for me. And I led him through some of the processes, some things he could expect. That was a no-brainer for me. That was like helping another human being. And at no point, I was comfortable enough with myself, of course, to say, well, it's not like me just having contact with him is going to pull me down or pull me in some area of impairment in my life that I
Have
don't
you ever
expect.
had a more personal relationship with somebody that you were formerly involved in addictions with?
Yeah, yeah.
Going
There are a
out?
lot of, I'm a musician, and there are fellow musicians who are that way too. And so sometimes I can't help but be surrounded by some of the people who also had, a rough patch, and some of those people I'm friends with. So yeah.
I mean, the next, this is a question we're not going to answer because it's a whole separate question and nobody asked it. There are situations where you could be, it's in the nature of addictive relationships, where you could be anchored to a person and you can't really abandon them for one reason, or like they're a family member.
Right, right.
And we're going to deal with that a little bit. And then the question becomes, how can I, which you began to get into, how do I maintain a relationship with this person while not dragging my own life down?
Right.
But we'll get into that a little bit in a further question. Let's move on to another question here now.
All right. So the essence of that question is, are you comfortable with who you are, and are you comfortable with who you are in association with that person, and what are your obligations versus what are your fears around, um, you know,
And you're never obligated. Well, you're never obligated to hurt yourself,
right.
but there are situations that are inescapable, which can be limiting.
Right. Okay. So we'll get into question 2. This is a lot, and I think I might be able to. I'm going to read this verbatim, and I'll think I can reframe it a little. It says, "Our son is back home and had to leave sober living for pot use. My husband became scary ill, and we cannot have stress. But while we laid down ground rules, he, my child, is smoking weed every morning and all night outside. He's driving high again and thinks he's fine. I'm noticing some peculiar change in him of intense focus going through his belongings that we have stored, finding things, drinking a lot, but not eating much. I found a few pills in one of his backpacks. He said it was Seroquel. Trying, of course, trying to, of course, love him where he's at, but the stress that this causes and the behavior changes makes me very uncomfortable. I asked him to kindly tell me what he was using, if anything. I tried to be open-minded, and he laughed. And when I mentioned that he was drinking a lot, I don't mean alcohol. I don't know what that means. He's acting like he took Adderall. I don't know what it's like if someone has used meth or fentanyl, but he's not nodding off, but I have a fear to be around him. All right, that's a lot in the same basket, but it sounds like that there's that this person has a son, and the son is home, and sort of by default, because he was kicked out of a sober living place for using marijuana. And there's a situation where one of the two parents, the husband, is ill, and he really can't. The family can't tolerate any more stress, but it looks like the son's putting some stress on them, and he may or may not be using. They know they've had a past where he's been using drugs, and she's looking at some of the behaviors and worried about it. It's a tense situation, and she doesn't know how to even bring up the topic with him because it's like a non-starter.
Well, there's so many stories that spin off in my mind. In my memoir, A Scientific Life on the Edge, I'm not really allowed to talk about therapy clients I've had. I could disguise them, but it's tough to do that. So I do describe one situation. I have pretty good teeth, but I have 3 baby teeth that had to be pulled and replaced. So I got to go to a top flight dental surgeon. And you can imagine in New York area, somebody who's pretty good at that, probably pretty good and unbelievably expensive. And when I came in, he started talking about his son, who had been a heroin guy. He had gone to Florida, and he was living in a halfway house, and he still smoked marijuana and drank. And the people told the surgeon, well, he's relapsed, he can't return home. And the surgeon was a smart guy, and he was saying, he asked me if that was true. And I said to him, well, it's not true. And if you want to really have him come home, the question isn't whether he's using some drugs. The question is whether he can meet your family obligation. This man had other children, whether he can meet the requirements of your household or not.
Right.
Whether it's satisfactory to you. Because
Right.
the kid, by now, he was an adult. It sounds like, by the time a person's 18 or 21, and even earlier, you need to expect certain kinds of behavior. So I had to come back later for another tooth to be replaced, baby tooth. And the guy said to me, as I describe in my memoir, you saved my family life. I let him come home and he had to go back to school and not be disruptive, which he did. And, thank you. So then when I got home, this was actually in the 80s before I was on email, I wrote him a letter and said, I saved your family life. You still charge me $7,500 for that tooth? Yeah. And he actually wrote me back. Like, he's a busy guy. And he said, Stanton, you don't realize that's a two-step process. And I didn't charge you, the $500 for, putting a stem in. I just charged you for the part of the surgery. And I said, okay. He felt he had to answer me, and he felt, okay, we had done a deal. But you and I, in our book, Outgrowing Addiction, discuss the differences between us and CRAFT, community reinforcement and family therapy, one of which is that we're not pushing people into therapy, which is often the end goal of CRAFT. That's one problem they have. But CRAFT has a pretty good framework for dealing with these kinds of situations. They say remain open and loving, which I think it's a woman, a mother says she is, but then you have to draw ironclad rules. Sort of gets back to the first question, where you can't allow the person to come into your life and harm it and, drag you down. That's just normal human interaction. And the CRAFT model is something like, if you can come into our house and meet our requirements, and I'm trying not to be overly rigid, like you can never smoke marijuana. She's saying she's not against taking drugs, but you can't misbehave and be absent without leave and be destructive. And this is a situation, again, it recalls something we spoke about in the first case. This mother needs help. The father's sick. The son could be coming into the house and making contribution and helping out, and he seems to be doing the reverse. And so we get down to a kind of a love and addiction type of question. You make this, the questioner makes it sound like an abusive relationship.
Between the son and her?
What's that?
Between the son and her?
Yeah.
Or abusive relationship between her? Okay,
Son
yeah.
and her.
Right.
And, we're not going to say, have an abusive relationship. And of course, it's your son. And like you say, you love him. You're not going to like say, that's it. Which people are doing more and more. There's an awful lot of interfamily alienation around trauma theory. But one last thing, I developed a family accompaniment to our life process program when I had a residential treatment program. And we would go through each of the sections of the life process program. And one of them is maturity and intimacy and family obligations, and your need to respond, to respect and be open, which this woman seems to be doing, like the author of that book was open to her son. She wasn't rejecting him. But at the same time, you have to be able to have a normal set of standards where you expect if you were a resident in my treatment program, you had to be responsible in your treatment of others. If this person would have been in my treatment program and our residential life process program, we would say, well, what are your obligations? What are your needs to be positive to people who are nurturing you and that you're intimate with? It's not abusing people isn't a relationship. Why don't you jump in, Zach? You must have been cooking a few ideas while I was going through my experiences.
Since I was young, I think like 20 years old, the kids who would just blow a gasket at school, who it was just a continual process. They'd come in and process with somebody, a counselor or a vice principal or something, and the vice principal would kind of lay down the law, or a guidance counselor would be warm and fuzzy with the child. They'd end the conversation. It'd feel like it was all good, then they'd go back and the kid would do the same behavior. And there were a lot of times I didn't realize I was doing it, that the kid would come talk to me once I was hired. I somehow was able to crack into this child and talk to them in a way that they were interested and they were listening, and they knew I was listening to them. They shared information with me. I shared information back, and I let them know, well, the thing is this, here are the expectations. They'd go back, and I still have a very high success rate with that, to the point where people are saying, how do you do that? How do you get someone to, we've been trying to talk to this kid for the last 5 years, and you kind of had a couple conversations with him or her, and they seem to be doing a lot better. What's going on? So I'll say a couple, I've had to think about how I do that so that I often get frustrated with other people because they're not doing it right, but how are they supposed to know if I'm not expressing what it is I'm doing? And some of the tricks I have, one of the things that struck me when she was in that question, when I was reading that question, was the part where the son laughed at her. She's trying to say something and he's laughing. And what I see people doing a lot is, and I don't know anything about the situation, but a lot of times in schools, let's say, people are reflecting back. They're using the standard, like in psychology textbooks, active listening and reflecting. There's a problem with that, because sometimes when you're reflecting, you're trying to reframe what somebody's saying. And if you're not reframing it in a way that they can find coherent, what you're really doing is creating a situation where you're their best shot at having someone listen to them, and you're reflecting back something that doesn't actually make sense to them. So it's like, oh, they're listening to me and they're showing me they're listening really carefully, and they still don't get it. So I could imagine this son having his fair share of problems. I mean, he did just get kicked out of a sober living house, and this mother trying to
he probably had to be in rehab before getting to the sober living house, I think.
He's not doing nothing. Like there's probably an element of what she's doing, whether she means to or not, that is sending the message to him that she thinks he's just doing it all wrong in perpetuity and not trying to do anything at all for himself. I'm nearly certain, because most people are like this, he doesn't like getting kicked out of places or feeling like he's a burden or a pest on his family. So there, I can imagine him being in a state where he's saying, God, I'm trying. I feel like I'm spinning my wheels and I'm trying all these different things. And, she's getting it wrong. She's trying to say, hey, why are you doing this? And I'm not doing it. So there's some communication lag. And so I like to open the conversations like this. First of all, I know that I have someone's attention if I can elicit the response no from them. For instance, is this a bad time to talk? People usually say something like, no, it's not a bad time to talk. Then you have their attention. And if they say it is a bad time to talk, you can let them tell you what would be a good time. And they usually tell you, and then they're planning on it, and then they have your attention. That's just an easy.
Getting a buy-in with the simplest possible question.
Right. People are usually looking for a yes or an agreement, and you're giving them the power. They get to either say no, and then they're agreeing with you, or they get to say yes, and anyway. Okay, so there's that, and then I would lay out the expectation first, or sorry, I would lay out what the difficulty is first. Something like, in this case, Dad is pretty sick, and it's been tense around here. It's hard for him to have any level of stress or anxiety, and it's been different. I mean, unfortunately, you've had to, it's not your choice, but you've had to come into this situation, and now it's added another element. So it seems like just by virtue of having three people here when three people weren't here before, things are a little more stressful than they have been. We all have to learn how to live with each other. What do you think's going on with that? And give the person a little bit of time to respond to what he might think. There's no accusation there. There's just and so you use that response and then use that time not to solve the problem yet, just sort of drill down into what's going on for that person. It's almost like it's not sneaky because you're being honest, but it's almost like you're sneaking your way into trying to get a sense of what's going on in that person's life. People will tend to get a little vulnerable with you if you are collaborative and all inclusive like that. And then I would get into, he might say, well, it's tough. I just got kicked out of this place. I'm trying to find a job. I'm still smoking sometimes. What can I do? Maybe he won't admit that yet. I don't know. What can I do? I'm trying to get sleep at night. Things are stressful for me. And you can keep using that intuitive openness that she mentioned by saying something like, God, I don't think about this very often. It's a whirlwind for you. A lot is going on. The thing is, and then you can kind of transition back. We need to keep a set of rules. We want to keep things basically the way that they were, before you started living with us, with the understanding that you have your own things going on. So there are a couple things that we want to make sure we keep stable. I wonder if there's a way that you can do everything you need to do, and that we can keep a certain set of boundaries in our house and limitations and expectations. It's still inviting. You're not getting anything specific. From there, I don't know, because I don't know the specifics. But that's usually the way I start a conversation. That's usually the middle of the conversation. And
now, how old? And when you vision this, how old is that kid you're talking to in general? If you had to pick a number.
If I'm talking to a kid,
yeah, when you do that,
it can be honestly any age. So 5 years old to 18 years old, I've had these conversations with. Now I was trying to do this on the part of this woman, but I will make it developmentally suitable for whatever age group. But that's the foundation remains the same of how that conversation goes.
I wanted to expand the Life Process program is people signing up on the internet and paying money, not much money. And kids can't do that. And so it's hard to have, and in my rehab, everybody had to be an adult. We didn't deal with kids. I mean, they were kids in the sense of being children of a parent. And, we've never really learned exactly how to do that. Could you in a phone consultation work with an adult and then talk with the child separately as a part of the Life Process program interaction? Is that doable?
I think that'd be fair. Yeah. I guess we've done it.
Expand our marketing to do that. I mean, what you're doing is age-appropriate motivational interviewing, where you get a person, you show that you're empathic and you're understanding them, and you get buy-in, not like it's some trick, because you're working together on a problem that you both are aware of. It's more of concern to that person than you. And, you've got a problem here. It seems you're not in your best place. How can we get beyond that or deal with that?
And by the way, we should be a little more specific about the whole boundary setting thing. There's one thing that gets in people's way sometimes. And I think that they go through a process of a conversation and they're kind of trying to remember a script and they forget to be authentic with a person. And I don't think it sets you back in any way to lay out the concerns on the table. Just be wide open with it. You get to a point where it's obvious. You can say, look, I love you. I care about you. I want you to be healthy. I'm stressed here. I'm trying to do my best, but I'm only one person. So I kind of need your help. I do worry about, you've had this past with, destructive drug use, and look, I don't need to know everything that you're doing, but I worry about it because I'm vulnerable like that, and maybe you can help me course correct here. There's no problem in laying out all the elements on the table that you're worried about. I think that's actually kind of endearing, disarming if you do that rather than you've got a card hidden, which I think is usually people are pretty intuitive about that.
In the first question, we brought out a little bit of a kind of a tough love response. Well, we talked about you might have to reject some people. And here I think you're showing your gift for empathy and working with people, but young people in particular. But I have a feeling that you're also, and I believe I've seen you do this, pretty clear and also setting down standards.
Mm-hmm.
I think somebody might listen to what you just said and say, oh, this guy's just too much of a pushover. But I don't think that's true of you. Oh, on the other hand, you're obviously, you don't go straight to the tough love response, but you do input obligations and responsibilities in this whole process.
Agree. That is an important thing. I'm willing to completely abandon a conversation. Sometimes the stress is, all right, I've been working up to this one conversation, this better go well, and everything hinges on it, and you're trying to do it right. And the last thing a person, especially a mother, let's say, wants to do in that case is be offensive or ruin the conversation or, make this person not want to walk away from it. First of all, that happens a lot once you get resentful enough about not being able to have the conversation that you start being either passive aggressive or aggressive, builds up over time and you yell at somebody or you start acting passive aggressive towards them. Second of all, it's if you're willing to understand that this is a relationship, so you'll have further conversations. I always say if something isn't working out, I'll say something like, we're not going to be able to have this conversation the way that we want to if you or I, whatever. And I do it's important to lay down some ground rules about what you can tolerate in a conversation. So yeah, in some ways people think, sometimes they'll see me and think, oh, you're kind of old school. You sound a little strict. And at the same time, it's like, well, but I can form a good relationship and conversation and clear understanding, and usually a happy one with the person I'm talking to. That's a skill, but it's also in some ways intuitive. Just try not to give the information, let people know how you feel, and be willing to revisit the conversation.
Well, I'm glad you threw that in because people sometimes find you strict and old school. I think that when you first responded, people might not have seen that was the other side of the coin.
Right.
And as you say, you obviously, you have some skill at imposing standards without making it seem like you're getting down on being offensive or antagonistic or disapproving of the person. There's some skills you're not going to be able to teach other people, but part of what you're describing is a model for a parent dealing with somebody. How those need to be the two sides of a coin. You have to stand up for yourself. You have to be clear on what's tolerable for you. At the same time that you don't do that in an accusatory way.
This is, we could go forever, but I don't want to do what I warned this person not to do with their son. I don't want to start getting so far afield that we're not even talking about her situation anymore, because we don't know really any information about her situation. So I'll just say that our lines are open. We're not so bombarded with emails or calls that we can't possibly handle them. So if this person wants to follow up, happy to get more specific.
Right. And I still retain, how we could, I've talked to you in different contexts, how we could, this is an internal marketing discussion, market your ability to do this, both with parents and with children. So this little example will have to be a little marketing outreach.
Let's go to the next question if you're comfortable with it.
Okay.
Which, if any, treatments for addiction would you personally agree that a pharmaceutical may be needed, or even the answer? That includes those behaviors that often lead to, let's say, self-medicating uncomfortable or problematic symptoms. And not my words on that would be, can drugs ever help solve the problem? You know, prescribed drugs, I guess. What would that scenario be? I think that the questioners sort of probably not her first time hearing us talk or knowing what our bent is, and I bet she's trying to wrap her mind around what your perception of MAT is, and you know what I'm saying?
I sometimes think of you, and we haven't discussed this, as being a little hardcore against psychiatric drugs. Is that accurate, or?
That I am?
Yeah.
At large, like as a whole.
So we share that a bit. I mean, there's a fundamental connect up syndrome that people have to make to live life, you know, and underlying use of psychiatric drugs is a sense that you're not going to be able to cut the mustard and do that possibly forever.
Right. That's what I'm against. That's what I'm sort of hardcore against. Yeah.
And part of it, I think your skill we talked about dealing with children is, well, this isn't going right, but I'm not putting you down, but let's move forward. I see a similar dynamic often working with psychiatric drugs where people are kind of saying, well, I'm too anxious, or I'm too compulsive, or I'm too perfectionist. That's a standard thing where people feel they're putting too much pressure on themselves. And a part of using a psychiatric drug is announcing that you're not right with yourself. And so a part of two parts of that, part of the process is accepting yourself. So, you know, I don't know, being compulsive, is that the worst thing in the world? And the second part of it is, well, I'm going to have to change how I deal with the world one way or another. Drugs can't be in the middle of that process. So then the question becomes, how does a drug help you transit, which is sort of what you're describing in the last question. How does, which is the same question as with therapy. How does therapy help you to transition to a better place? And the question can sometimes, and the answer can sometimes be, obviously, if somebody's extremely depressed, you need to do something with that. At the same time, Aaron Beck just died. And Aaron Beck did comparative clinical studies with even quite depressed people, where social learning therapy, cognitive behavior therapy was superior to the drug therapy. And often, in and of itself, sometimes there are remarkably little benefits from the drug therapy. And, you know, there hasn't been a new antidepressant for decades. And in some clinical trials, they've added so little benefit, and primarily only at the very high end of the process, which gets a little bit back into the question of medicine-assisted treatment, which is now medicine for opioid use disorder. Dying is a bad outcome. And in short-term controlled situations, you know, using a controlled opioid, you're not going to die if you're following your Suboxone or your methadone prescription. But that can't be the end goal of therapy. It's a transition, it's a harm reduction, it's a life-saving technique. But the goal is always imagining, you know, I'm not a religious man, but it's God put you on earth to function as a human being. I was describing the father of a colleague of ours, who's a very religious man, who could deal with any problem. And I believe his mechanism would be to say, well, God didn't put this person on earth because, God was mistaken. They belong on earth. Even a highly, child with large disabilities. Now, he was like, almost a saint. So I don't know that everybody could do that. But the goal is to accept yourself and another person in the sense of not seeing the fact that you do things in a certain way in a negative light exclusively, and then recognizing that you were meant to be a fully functioning human being, and you can do that. So within that context, I'll leave it up to people to decide, well, I need this drug to get by, but that should never be cast as, I need this drug to function.
It's again, I think you said, it's kind of like the previous question, or the past two previous questions. Are you against therapy? Well, we're against sort of the recovery racket. And then on the other hand, we have a program that's on the website. It says, online recovery program. I don't know if we have a certain definition of recovery that is pretty commonsensical. So it's like
you have to have in there so people know what the heck you're selling.
You can't have such it's a fallacy to be too black and white about things, but in essence, what we're saying is it matters why someone is taking a drug. It matters why somebody is using therapy. What's its usefulness, and how does it help you empower yourself and in your life? I went for it with a new doctor that I had. I've told you this before. When you visited, I was taking like an Adderall kind of drug, Vyvanse, and it was prescribed for ADHD. And I told my wife, I don't need this. I like to have it, but this doctor's such a pain in the ass. She talks to me like I have this disorder, so you think I'm cutting it off. And then I got a new doctor, and so I thought, you know what? I'm gonna tell her exactly why I use it, and if she cuts me off of it, whatever, that'll kind of piss me off. But what am I gonna do? It's not like I need it to live or function. By the way, I like when I have a deadline to meet or something that I'm doing and I've exhausted myself in the day, I'll take these. But I take them fewer and fewer as I'm sort of managing my life strategy and trying to balance. So I'll put that on the table. So I told my doctor, look, I don't think I have a disorder. Most people who have a disorder don't, write books, do 100 productive things every single day, have a good fit. So I would like to continue this prescription. And the problem is that if there's some sort of like a drug test I have to do to see if I'm taking it all the time, or if I'm going to take it just sometimes when I feel like it. And that's probably getting pretty close to like, I'm just a drug user. And so I just want to let you know that, so that if you want to go forward. She sounds like, she said, that sounds really reasonable. The only thing with that relationship is that she has to bill it under I have ADHD. So there's some maybe problem down the road there, but she continues to happily prescribe a medication. I guess it's sort of like a wink and a nod, but an understanding among, between each other that I kind of just like to do it. So
Next question. What's your favorite drug that you've used, Stanton? Is that the next question?
Uh-huh. Oh, no, that's not the next one. We can go there, though.
Let's jump to that question. Because you've just sort of answered the question, what drug do you like? You just answered that question.
All right, but let me just wrap up.
Okay.
So I'm pretty confident that the reason I'm taking a drug is for some kind of enhancement. And I'm also confident that if that drug was no longer in existence, then I'm still who I am. And I think that not everyone is there. So that's just to say, first of all, I can't be against prescription drugs because I'm taking them. But also, I don't think everyone is comfortably where, if this drug was eliminated from the earth, who cares? So I do think that there are drugs are useful. It's just what's underlying the prescription and what's the story being told about why someone's prescribed a drug. That's important. So however that person can get comfortable with that understanding, the
So
better.
you could see where you would be if you didn't find a conducive doctor, and if you were a person who was against illegal activity, you could see where you would be a person who would buy Adderall or some equivalent drug on the street. That could be a possible thing if you couldn't get a doctor. The drug has a purpose, and it's not usually the kind of thing that you can always get a medical provider to provide. But people are using drugs like that, sometimes off the street, as a way of coping with life because they can't, which I think we would both endorse. We're in favor of medical prescription of everything, or drug provision sites or drug provision sites, because our general feeling is, well, people use drugs for reasons.
Mm-hmm.
and they'll do better if the drugs are the real drugs, as opposed to purchasing on the street. And they'll do better often with a provider who can provide some kind of structure. But that provider will have to have something like motivational interviewing skills, which is to say, okay, I'm not putting you down because you want to use this drug or you want to use this drug in that way. But, we're going to try and take any rough edges off that, be aware of harm reduction techniques.
Right. So what's your favorite drug?
The quick answer is, this is also going to be why I'm not a drug addict. The quick answer is, I had a girlfriend who was taking an Adderall or Adderall type drug. That's a hard drug to beat. At the time, I had a tough job. It was after my divorce, and I needed health insurance. So I got a job working in senior care facilities as a psychological provider. That could be a tough job. First of all, I had to drive to different facilities. Took up a lot of the day. And then secondly, some of the people were not in a position to progress very well. But, high on an amphetamine, that all seemed pretty reasonable. And I could positively engage with everything. So let me tell you why I don't, your description, there's a certain amount of Folderol you have to do to get Adderall or a comparable kind of drug.
Right.
And so the brief answer for me is, I'm too lazy and too cheap to be a drug addict. Because the process, as I understood it, was you had to go to a psychiatrist. I'd have to go into New York every 3 months. And psychiatrists, they have to talk to you to justify their fee. But it's, 20 minutes, and they're not really therapists. It's not therapy you're doing. And it was just too much trouble for me to get the drug. I just didn't want to ride into New York. And I live in Brooklyn, which is part of New York, but I didn't want to do all that. And so, what I tried to learn from that is, what is it exactly this drug does for me? And can I duplicate its effects on my own? Can I reproduce the effects of the drugs? I know what it feels like to be kind of like, I'm not worried about anything. I'm on Adderall or an amphetamine. Feels pretty good. This situation seems like funky, and I'm not really going to make a lot of progress with this person with dementia. But, if you look at it the right way and you're a little bit relaxed and you are both involved but distancing yourself, you can make that be a productive situation. So, drugs can provide valuable experiences, and sometimes I try to learn from them. Which gets back to there's now, from time to time, I'll be in a situation where when I was in college, I was at the very beginning level of taking marijuana. It was illegal and people didn't do it. You could get arrested. And I would take marijuana on my own as a sole. I didn't use it with other people. I knew a woman who said she was studying marijuana. They were telling her about marijuana, and they said people never use marijuana alone. But I used to love to take marijuana alone and read a book, and then later read the book and see how I perceived it differently. And I'm a person, well, I had a girlfriend who we used to take marijuana cookies with, and she would be wildly creative. She was a very wildly creative person. And I'd say, well, and would you write down everything that you're coming up with? And then, when we sobered up, I would say, well, let's go over it. I want to see what was on your mind. She was somewhat self-conscious. Sometimes she'd say, well, that was a good idea. So what I described doing with Adderall, I try to do with psychedelics. There's been a bestseller now, Changing Your Mind. Psychedelics are big now. And so, but I don't have the time or the patience to do drugs mainly. And so what I try to do is imagine, well, what is it about those kinds of drugs and how that kind of, where you let yourself go free and relax and let all kinds of new thoughts come into your mind, can you mindfully recreate the psychedelic drug experience?
So what is your favorite drug? What's the favorite drug you've ever taken? Would it be
the favorite drug, the drug that can't be beat is like Adderall, but it was too much trouble to get it, and I'm not going to get left off the street.
And so now sort of mindfulness in the way of thinking about what you want from the experience is the way that you recreate your favorite drug experience.
And the drug I take the most, I'll jump into two other drugs just to describe they're on people's minds. In my memoir, I described taking heroin casually when I was younger. And of course I could get, well, I have taken painkillers, I've had medical procedures. As a rule of thumb, most people don't like the opioid experience. It's a little bit specialized. And so when I had a girlfriend in college who lived with heroin guys, and so I took heroin, I would inject it with them. And, I couldn't have an erection or an orgasm. And, it's a calming and dulling drug. And I was, in my mind at the time, I was familiar with LSD and marijuana. And I say, how's this, and they would say, well, it's like a sliding scale, marijuana, LSD, heroin. I say, well, these are totally different things. And the heroin thing, I don't like, I don't want it. And so I do that kind of an exercise with people. I'll say to people, well, you've taken an opioid. How was that for you? And most people don't want that experience. And for example, the self-maintained analgesia is something that people found very daring, where you let people regulate their painkiller while they're in the hospital. People use less than if they're prescribed it. Because if you're prescribed it, the person has to come in and say, well, you have to take this pill every 4 hours. And people want to taper off opioids. On the other hand, one exercise, so I'll do an exercise with any group of people, and I'll say, well, you took painkillers. Did you become addicted? And they'll always say, well, I stopped taking them, actually. I didn't even finish the prescription. And I'll have to drop a name now. I was on the board of Above and Beyond in Chicago, and that was a organization, a community addiction recovery community, harm reduction. And he's like a billionaire healthcare investor who has a humanitarian, wants to help people part. So he's a hard guy to beat. And in a board meeting, I say, well, has anybody here taken a painkiller? Of course, everybody raises their hand. And he described how, well, it was kind of an intriguing experience for him, but he was so, he had to get up every morning and do all these things. So he just had to stop it, that's the fallback position where people say, there's something kind of alluring or intriguing about the opioid narcotic experience, but, I've got a life and I'm tied into it. So my narcotics just did nothing for me. And the smaller group it does something for, it has the attachment to life is the thing that usually leads them away from it. So now I'll tell the drug I use the most is alcohol. And I'm a healthcare nut who believes that alcohol, I've written about it lately for Filter. It's the last thing I did for Filter. Alcohol makes you live longer. And so I had to learn to drink. I came from my parents weren't temperance, they were Jewish. They hardly drank. They drank ceremonial wine. I had to learn to drink, and I was married to a woman who knew how to drink. And that was one of the reasons, I wasn't why I married her, but that was a great plus about her. And so the question is who and how you drink. And I drink for health purposes. So you mentioned I drink bourbon in my coffee in the morning. It's almost like I'm taking my medication early. But late in the afternoon, it depends on how good the bar is. And bars differ all over the place. And one reason people go to bars, a great thing about bars, is that you get to socialize with people, some of whom you would not ordinarily run into. And lately, bars have become crappy because you'll go into a bar, you'll see a whole bunch of men along the bar all on their cell phone. And that, to me, is like the end of drinking or the end of going to bars. But I just now, the last couple of months, have found a bar after the pandemic, which is a combination. I'm in Brooklyn. It's on the street you and I walk past, Coney Island Avenue. And, all kinds of people come in there, people who are trans, firemen, working class guys, young professionals. And in general, people are interested in talking. And so that bar has re-engaged my desire, to drink in a public place. I usually get, right now, you can get those mixed drinks. Sometimes they're fun. I usually get a Guinness, which I consider God's gift to humankind. I think alcohol is healthy, but Guinness, when I was once coming back from South Africa with a pipe fitter from Ireland, and he said in the recovery room, they give everybody Guinness. And that's one reason I'm considering moving to Ireland. And then lately, maybe I'll have like a decent scotch along with that, although Guinness is a little too much of a beer to match with the scotch. So currently, that's my favorite kind of a drink. And I should mention I ride my bike to the bar. So there's two ways of looking at that. I'm 75, should you really drink and ride a bike in Brooklyn? There are people who won't ride a bike in Brooklyn forgetting about drinking. It ain't easy going. On the other hand, I'm not going to get intoxicated knowing that I have to get out there and get on my bike.
Right.
And ride it, a mile or two.
So Adderall is your favorite drug, but since you're too lazy to go get it, maybe you would have needed Adderall to get the motivation to go get the Adderall. Alcohol is a happy second.
I had to pay for my own prescriptions.
Yeah.
I'm too cheap. I'm too consciousness oriented. I want to keep my mind working all the time. I'm too cheap, and I'm too lazy to become a drug addict.
The alcohol is a happy second for you, both for health, socialization, and just for some enjoyment.
Alcohol during happy hour because they price us down. Yeah. The guy, there's a trans bartender, and they have music night. And I said, Well, I'd like to see it, but as you know, I'm never here past 7 o'clock at the end of happy hour. If you ever saw me here at midnight, and then he's a caring guy. He said, if I ever saw you at midnight, I'd come up to you and say, are you all right, Stan? Because you shouldn't be here at midnight.